You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, a short bonus episode to remind you about these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the Battle of Quebec, December 31st, 1775. From the beginning, the Americans hoped to draw Quebec into the rebellion. The Patriots believed that if they could show that Britain was unable to hold on to Canada by force, that the people of Quebec would join the rebellion. General Richard Montgomery had led a continental invasion from Fort Ticonderoga into Canada, capturing Montreal. At the same time, Colonel Benedict Arnold had taken a force across the Maine wilderness to reach the walls of Quebec from the other side. The walled city of Quebec, however, remained defiant. Although Montgomery had captured almost all the regulars in Canada, a group of militia, made up primarily of Scottish Highlander immigrants, held the city. Half of Arnold's force never arrived, believing the wilderness march would be impossible. Much of Montgomery's force had demanded to be sent home after the capture of Montreal. Even worse, most of the men who had held out this long looked forward to the end of the year when their enlistments ended and they could go home. By the time the two armies converged on Quebec in early December, they had less than a month before the army would dissolve away. They couldn't count on George Washington to send reinforcements. He was facing his own end-of-the-year deadline when the Continental Army around Boston turned into a group of 15,000 civilians. By December 6th, the Continental Army had surrounded Quebec. Montgomery offered terms if the city surrendered, but the city refused. Montgomery used his field artillery, but his small field cannons were useless against the city's stone walls. Inside the city, Governor General Guy Carleton felt pretty secure. His Highlander regiment and Navy sailors had whipped up the citizenry into an effective militia force. Carleton had about 1,800 men ready to defend the city against about 1,200 attackers who would have to charge into entrenched lines and artillery. Unable to get the city to surrender, and unable to mount an artillery barrage, and unable to field an army long enough for a siege, Montgomery found himself left only with a long shot. Wait for a stormy night when the enemy was not ready, then storm the walls with scaling ladders and take the city. Quebec City consists of two parts. The upper town on the west side faced the Plains of Abraham, and this is where any large army would have to attack. Therefore, the defenders had their highest walls and most of their artillery in this section. Behind the upper town was the lower town, where most of the civilian population lived. This area had walls, but they were not quite as high as those in the upper town, and most of the lower town was surrounded by the St. Lawrence and St. Charles rivers. There was no room to put a large military force on the narrow strip of land between the walls and the rivers on this side of town. Montgomery's plan was to send a small force against the upper town as a feint, while less than 200 men launched a cannon and rocket attack against the main gate. Arnold would move along the northern wall and attack the lower town from the north. Montgomery would move along the southern wall and would attack the lower town from the south. The two forces would hopefully get through their lines, meet in the middle, and then slowly work their way through town past a series of barricades until they reached the upper town. From there, the combined force would either storm the upper town walls or compel a surrender. The Continentals had a hard time waiting for a stormy night as the clock was ticking toward that January 1st deadline. Finally, on the night of December 30th, a storm allowed Montgomery to put his plan into motion at around 5 a.m. on the morning of December 31st. As Arnold and Montgomery both moved into position, the diversion force launched its assault against the main gate on the western side of the city. After getting into position, Montgomery led his advance force directly against the enemy line. The defenders held their fire until Montgomery and his men were within 50 yards of their lines. Then they all opened fire with devastating effect. Most of the attackers fell dead or wounded. General Montgomery, who had been out in front leading the charge, was hit in at least 3 places and died instantly. The first Continental Army general to die in battle. Command of the southern attack fell to Lieutenant Colonel Donald Campbell, who was bringing up a second line of attackers. Had Campbell renewed the attack, he might have succeeded. The militia defending against the southern assault were ready to run away. Their officers actually had to keep them in their lines at gunpoint. A second charge might have been enough to chase them away. Then again, a second attack might have suffered the same consequences as the first attack that took out Montgomery. Campbell decided not to take that gamble. He turned his men around and retreated back the same narrow trail that they had taken to get there. So the southern assault was over. While Montgomery was attacking, Colonel Arnold moved his force into position on the north side of town. Like Montgomery, Arnold charged an embedded line of soldiers armed with muskets and cannon. Like Montgomery, Arnold led the charge and was shot in the first volley. Unlike Montgomery, Arnold only took a shot in the leg and would survive. Even so, he could not continue, and he turned over command to Colonel Daniel Morgan. Unlike Montgomery's second-in-command, Morgan charged forward, leading the assault with his attackers scaling ladders up a wall in the face of enemy fire. They scattered the defenders at the first barricade and took about 100 prisoners. Morgan attempted to advance his men toward an unmanned barricade, but they would not go. Only a few dozen of them had advanced past the first barricade. The rest said they needed to wait for a larger force before simply running into a part of town that probably contained over 1,000 defenders. Reinforcements were on the way, but they got lost on the docks and in the streets of Quebec. Remember that it was still at night, it was the middle of a snowstorm, and they were in an unfamiliar town. Before Morgan could assemble a large enough force, the British defenders in the upper town sent 30 Highlanders to put some backbone into the 200 militia who were supposed to be defending that second barricade. Morgan's attackers now found themselves stuck in street fighting, with the defenders picking them off from the upper floors of houses as they marched through the streets of town. The defenders realized that the attack on the main gate had been a feint and that Montgomery's attack from the south was over, so they could force all their attention on Morgan's soldiers now scattered all over the lower town. The defenders circled around and recaptured the first barricade that Morgan's men had taken. Now the Patriots were caught in the city between the first and second barricades with nowhere to go. House-to-house fighting continued for hours as soldiers began to take refuge in houses. As morning broke, the Patriots found themselves trapped, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Morgan tried to order a retreat, but most of the men refused to leave the safety of the houses. They would have had to run a gauntlet of fire down the street, only to face a wall of hundreds of enemy defenders before they could break out of the city again. So after daylight, almost all of them surrendered, except Morgan. The British trapped Morgan in a house and surrounded him in a back room. Even then, he refused to give up, slashing his sword at anyone who tried to come near him. Eventually, a Catholic priest came into the house, and Morgan finally, reluctantly, turned over his sword to the priest. By late morning, the fighting was over. As usual, casualty reports differ. The Patriots suffered about 50 dead and another 40 wounded, but well over 400 were taken prisoner, almost all of the attack force that had been led by Arnold and then Morgan. The defenders suffered very little. Official reports claim only 5 killed and 14 wounded, but other estimates indicate that maybe 40 or 50 died or suffered very serious injuries in that battle. With General Montgomery's death, Colonel Arnold took command of the remaining force of about 800 men still surrounding Quebec. This included several hundred Canadians and Indians who had joined the Patriot side. Arnold had no intention of retreating or even withdrawing. His men, however, had different ideas. Most of their enlistments had expired on January 1st, 1776, and following this loss, many of them simply started to head home. From his field hospital bed, Arnold tried to force the men to return, but other officers refused to obey his orders. Arnold could not get more reinforcements. The Continental Congress promoted Arnold to brigadier general, but they could not send him any more soldiers to attempt a second assault. So Arnold remained outside the walls of the city of Quebec. In the spring, British reinforcements would arrive, securing Quebec and forcing the Americans to retreat back to New York. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. To learn more about these events, You can listen to episodes 78 and 79 of the American Revolution podcast. Please subscribe for free on whatever podcast platform you like. And thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.